Panic set in before anyone had time to prepare. Inside the factories that feed the Pentagon supply chains, machines are falling silent. Shipments of rare earth magnets, critical to everything from F-35 jet fighters to Javelin missiles, simply aren't arriving. In June, Chinese exports of those magnets collapsed by 75% compared with the year before. Reuters reported on June 27, 2025. The silence in these plants isn't symbolic. It is literal. Assembly lines stop, deliveries are missed, and contracts worth billions risk default. At the root of this seizure lies Beijing's tightening grip. In mid-June, China's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology rolled out interim regulations governing the mining, processing, and trade of rare earths. The rules apply not only to what is mined domestically, but also to foreign or imported for refining, locking the West out of capacity it doesn't control. AP News described it as a licensing and quota maze filled with vague metrics and lengthy approvals, leaving buyers waiting weeks without certainty. The effect cascades. A Pentagon memo circulated in July warned that inventories of neodymium iron boron magnets, NdFeB, the workhorse of modern weapon systems, were dropping into single-digit weeks of supply. That aligns with a June Financial Times investigation finding that 90% of US defense systems rely on critical minerals originating in China. These are not hypothetical dependencies, they are visible in real contracts. Gavini, a defense analytics firm, found that across 43,000 supply chains extending 6 tiers deep, Chinese links appear somewhere in the chain. High-impact numbers drive the urgency. On August 21st, Reuters reported that the Department of Defense is rushing to buy as much as $500 million worth of cobalt over the next 5 years to stabilize reserves. Suppliers were restricted to allies like Canada, Japan, and Norway. The Pentagon's unusual direct intervention in raw mineral procurement illustrates how quickly the shortage turned from a contractor's headache into a national security alarm. For companies at the edge, the restrictions bite even harder. Propelled, a drone propulsion manufacturer in New Hampshire, applied for a license to import Chinese rare earth magnets. The paperwork demanded technical drawings and use declarations and customer lists. Information executives refused to hand over. Their request was denied, and production for Ukraine-bound drones halted for months. By the time they sourced alternative suppliers, they discovered those firms themselves depended on Chinese feedstock. Decoupling wasn't an option. The cycle only reinforced the paradox. Every path eventually runs back to Beijing. Prices reveal the desperation. The Wall Street Journal reported in July that a buyer of samarium, a rare earth used in jet engines, faced offers 60 times higher than normal. Leonardo DRS, which builds missile sensors, signaled that German manium shortages would soon delay deliveries. Even major firms like Raytheon, long aware of the risks, admit that inventories stretch only months ahead. 2 years earlier, Raytheon's chief executive had warned that replacing Chinese magnets by 2027 was, well, impossible. Now, the warning looks understated. Factories are not just halting in the United States. In Japan, Reuters reported in July that shipments of rare earth magnets dropped so sharply that automakers were forced to pay premiums of more than 40% above market rates to secure emergency supplies by air. In Germany, the Federation of Industries warned that licensing delays in Beijing were being weaponized to exert political pressure, a statement that directly contradicted China's Ministry of Commerce, which insists the controls are purely regulatory. In South Korea, LG Intech confirmed that its magnet supply for camera modules and sensors had been cut by nearly half, forcing them to shift orders to Malaysia, where the feedstock again originated in China. The ripple spreads beyond defense and autos. Bloomberg reported that AI server manufacturers are redesigning cooling fans and motor systems because the high heat-resistant magnets normally used containing dysprosium and terbium are unobtainable. That redesign reduces efficiency by nearly 30% in some systems, which in turn drives up electricity costs. The Wall Street Journal added that Ford's license approvals, when granted, expire in 6 months, forcing the company into constant renegotiation and stripping away long-term planning. China now controls 90% of high-strength rare earth magnet output, while the US holds barely 1%. prices for gallium used in radar and semiconductors have risen by 200% since April. Western officials acknowledge in private that one more licensing clampdown could not only halt weapons production but also paralyze entire green energy sectors simultaneously. That unresolved tension creates a new question. What invisible barriers persist beyond the raw export numbers? The answer is buried in licensing and political discretion. Reuters reported on August 22nd that Beijing quietly expanded quotas to cover both domestic and imported rare earths. That means even if the US finds or elsewhere, refining in China remains constrained. AP News added that customs authorities are cracking down on smuggling, detaining shipments, transiting through third countries and requiring them to return to origin. What appears as higher export tonnage overall masks targeted denials for defense end users. Meanwhile, Western governments are scrambling to improvise. The Pentagon took a stake in MP Materials, which is the largest US rare earth miner, in order to accelerate construction of its 10X facility in Texas. The Wall Street Journal reported that Apple injected $500 million into the same venture to secure domestic supply for its own devices with $200 million prepaid. But even this plant, once it's operational, will still depend on technologies and processing expertise imported from Asia. Scaling domestic capacity honestly requires years, while shortages are immediate. Allies are moving in parallel. India signed bilateral agreements this summer to secure critical minerals after its own supply chains showed strain from Chinese controls. Germany's main industry association publicly urged Beijing to speed approvals, warning that automakers just cannot plan under current uncertainty. Even in consumer markets, the ripple spreads. Ford temporarily shut down its Chicago SUV plant in May after rare earth shortages stalled motor production. Lisa Drake, Ford's vice president of industrial planning, told the Wall Street Journal that the company is moving things around daily to keep lines running, describing the situation as hand-to-mouth. The numbers underline the imbalance. China accounts for 70% of rare earth mining and over 90% of global refining, while the US controls less than 2% of reserves. Reserves don't equal capacity. Even countries with deposits often ship raw ore to China for processing. In June, Reuters noted that attempts to build refining plants in Australia and the US remain constrained by environmental hurdles, cost, and technical barriers. China's advantage isn't only geological, it's infrastructural, accumulated over decades of state-directed investment. The sprint to compensate exposes new vulnerabilities. Contractors now rely on air freight for magnets whenever licenses are approved. Despite costs several times higher than ocean shipping, smaller private Chinese magnet makers struggling under quotas are quietly offering workarounds, suggesting buyers switch to less powerful ferrite magnets that avoid controlled materials. But for high-end systems, jet engines, radars, AI servers, substitution is impossible. Olive Lean, a Taiwan-based cooling system specialist, told Reuters in July that companies are redesigning products around weaker magnets, only to discover performance collapses. As this reality sets in, Washington and Brussels shift their rhetoric. What began as a push to decouple now looks like de-risking. NATO's June summit in The Hague codified a commitment to spend 5% of GDP annually on defense by 2035, up from the long-standing 2% pledge. At least 312% must go to core defense requirements. But more money doesn't solve material scarcity. Even if European and American defense budgets cross $500 billion, those funds cannot conjure magnets if Chinese licenses are withheld. In trying to escape dependency, the West may be engineering a new one. MP Materials propped up by Pentagon and Apple dollars risks becoming a single point of failure. A domestic monopoly replacing a foreign one. Stockpiling cobalt and rare earths ties future defense capacity to financial speculation on volatile commodities. Substitution experiments already degrade performance, threatening long-term competitiveness. The effort to break free could paradoxically cement new bottlenecks, where one American firm or one allied mind becomes as indispensable as China once was. The crisis doesn't end with a solution. It ends with a reframing. The real story isn't that factories are silent today. It's that the scramble to restart them may redefine who controls tomorrow's weapons. China's leverage comes not only from today's export bans, but from decades of investment that allowed it to dictate terms. And the United States, in seeking independence, may find itself once again bound, this time to a new, narrower, and equally fragile chain of supply.